Yeah, Peter, thank you very much for the invitation and the short introductions. Always good to make it short. And glad to see you all here in Prague. I really like the city very much, and a number of colleagues who I know already now for not being here for the first time. But the first time I'm talking about my most liked site, which I'm actually working on, researching on for more than 2 decades now, and it never gets langweilig. It's always very interesting to work on it, and there are always new aspects of this site which are really weird. I must say that new. Actually, I brought you some definitely very new results, which are still preliminary, but most interesting in some natural scientific cooperations I did with colleagues. I will come to that later on. So you're the first to hear about them today, and perhaps you have some good ideas what they might mean. As I was not sure whether everybody here is a specialist in LBK, although a site where Billani has been studied for decades, that should be the case, but just as a short lecture about the LBK, which starts with agriculture being developed in the fruitful crescent here. And then we have two ways of the emergence of people, of migrations of people from this area over long periods of time. Naturally, it starts at about 9,000 with agriculture in the fruitful crescent. And then we have one way going on the coasts, actually. Here, the Mediterranean coastline. These are the cardial cultures or groups with cardial pottery, which are here. But for us, most interesting is the red arrow here, which goes over the big rivers, the Danube, the Rhine, into the northwestern territories of Europe. And these are the linear pottery groups or linear pottery culture, which is then spread over vast parts of Europe, which you can see here in the older phase between 5,600, it's rather 5,400. I heard things are changing. These are older dates probably, so let's say 5,500 around that time to 5,300. And they stop at the Rhine actually with their development of agricultural sites. But then around 5,300, they cross the Rhine, and very quickly the Palatinate, which is the area here around Herxheim, here we have the Elsass, is occupied actually with lots of band ceramic site that goes in 100 years or so. It's really astonishing. And on the height of its development, the band ceramic is spread from nearly the Black Sea up to the Ukraine here to the Paris Basin. So it's an area of around 700,000 square kilometers. It's really a huge area where band ceramic people live. And they come with all their need for being proper tillers. So they have their seeds for lentils and peas and mainly grains and crops with them. They know how to form pottery and fire it afterwards, and they know how to make stone adzes and special materials for felling trees and using wood. And they also bring their animals with them. We know that the ADNA of LBK cattle is most similar to nowadays Anatolian cattle. So it's really interesting they at least brought them from Anatolia here. We don't have any wild forms of goat and sheep in Europe at this time, so they must have brought them. And we know that they all brought their pigs with them. And why do we call them band ceramic, which is more common than, I think, linear pottery ceramic? It's just when you roll off their ornamentation, at least in the early phases, it's just like bands going over the whole pots, and that's what some a German colleague, called it around the beginning of the 20th century, or let's call them linear band ceramic or short band ceramic, or the acronym LBK, which is most used because it's the shortest one. So you will hear it more often in my lecture because it helps me spare some time for more information. So they settle in an area which is densely covered with deciduous forests. So they really have to fell lots and lots of trees for their agricultural sites, for their fields, and naturally for their settlement as well. And we have to imagine in the beginning, it looks like, you know, islands in the vast forests we have in Middle Europe. And they built huge houses, and they need lots of wood for them. If you see the skeleton of band ceramic house, there are, I don't know, I've never counted them, but it's a huge number of oak trees which you need to just construct one house. And that's a recently reconstructed house in the southern Netherlands in Limburg, Moorfeld. It's very nicely done, and you get an impression of these houses. But if you walk into such a, in this case, reconstructed house, I think I made this photo in this house here, you see there's not so much room as one would imagine from houses being between 20 and 50 meters long and 6 to 8 meters wide, but you get all these posts in there, so there's not so much room, and we don't have any storage sheds or buildings where you can store your grains, your hay, and other materials. So it means all their possessions must be in these big houses. And then there's not room for 20 or 30 people in there. Probably these are families, 3 generations perhaps, so 6 to 10 people mostly probably lived in there. The burial practice just fleetingly noticed here, but they are sort of important because in Herxheim everything is very different from the typical burial practices. We have cemeteries like the huge one in Schwetzing in Baden-Württemberg here with over 300 graves, mostly skeleton graves. That means the bodies were put into grave pits and then covered with earth. But we also have some cremation graves as well. These are normally more shallow than the skeleton graves, so maybe quite a number of them are also lost due to erosion or other things. And from the skeleton burials we find, and that is just if we compare the number of settlements we have and we compare the number of cemetery sites all together over the whole of the Bandkeramik, then it's perhaps 20 or 30% of the people who lived there of whom we have found their graves. So that means that lots of people were buried in ways which we archaeologically can't detect. We have an idea, they put them on trees or whatever. But if we find skeleton burials, the typical position is a flexed one. These are the so-called Hockerbestattungen, like with these flexed legs and the arms in front of the heads. They may have grave goods like here, or some jewelry like the famous woman of Eiterhofen here with a whole huge number of snail shells which were on some sort of head covering there, but there are quite a number of skeletons without any grave goods as well. So that's the short introduction to the Bandkeramik and all. What I forgot when talking about burials, which we thought in the beginning that it was something very unusual, were burials in settlements. We now know that nearly every settlement has its burials inside the area of the settlement as well. So that is not something unusual. It's just a way of burying people as well. Although in the settlement, there are always a smaller, much smaller number than we find in huger cemeteries. So just to give you an idea where which site we're talking about. So you have Prague here, that is Nuremberg. And here we have Mannheim, which is a rather big town, Frankfurt. And here, approximately 15 kilometers on the west side of the Rhine, we have Herxheim, a small community, 6,000–7,000 inhabitants, actually. You have here this distance from Speyer to Herxheim is not very far. I was there so often, or you can drive it, you know, with eyes closed, and it's about 25 kilometers from Speyer. And you see the Rhine is not so nice, was not so nice as it is nowadays after the Tuller developments here. We had all these waves here meandering the Rhine in older times, so it was probably nearer to Herxheim as well, but not really near the site anyway. So we have an aerial view of nowadays Herxheim, and on their western side, they decided we need a new industrial area, and that's the only point where it can be done. Unfortunately, and you see they really realized it, because that's a view from some, don't know, month ago or so. In this area, we had already hundreds of archaeological finds from linear Bandkeramik, from Bronze Age, from early Iron Age. The Romans had been there because we had all these sherds which people collected in decades on this promontory, small promontory here. It's very good soil there. We have huge meters, and I think up to 4 meters of löss on the lower ground. So it's still today one of the most fertile areas in Germany is in southern Palatinate, and the Bandkeramik people knew that. Obviously, they came there also. So directly here, where there's also a circle from streets here, nearly in the middle of the area there actually was the site of Herxheim, with 2 ditches surrounding the area of the settlement. And it's a typical situation, actually, from the topography. It's just a normal band ceramic site, you know, on a small promontory, not really high. You don't really see it when you drive there, that it's a bit higher. Two small rivers surrounding the site. It's just 100 meters, the one here, the Schambach, and the Klingbach is about 200, 400 meters away. So it's very typical. Nothing hinted to this being a very special site from the standpoint of topography. And that might be just a view of Herxheim in one of its periods, just a part of the village. You have in the background the Palatinate forest, middle range mountain, and that's an actual photo. That's how you see it from Herxheim, because a colleague of mine, he just made a photo and then he produced all these nice band ceramic parts in the foreground. If you look at this area photo, you see both of the ditches here. That's our research excavations from the 2000s, 2005 to 2008. We had another excavation. That was the first one, a rescue excavation, because they wanted very quickly to develop this industrial zone here. So you see better on this plan. We have the two ditches, and you see that 4 years where you needed to excavate this big part, and for the small part, we also needed 4 years in a research excavation. It means we worked very differently from a rescue excavation where there's not very much money, time is always pressing, and we had more money, fortunately, and more time to really do things in a more differentiated way. Actually, we did a survey here in 2010, or two of them, to know what happened here, because in the geomagnetic, which we did on all this area, there was no trace of these two ditches, and we are sure now. We also did boreholes here, several ones on the eastern side. There never was a ditch or double ditch on the eastern side. On most of it, we have this small river coming down here, and we know that these ditches were never used for defensive measurements or something like that. And they were not built when the village was first built here, because we have pits with material which is only from the Flambon phase. That meant around 5,000. It's not the first part of the Flambon phase, so they may have started settling here at about 5,250, something like that. And then the settlement goes on until the end of the LBK west of the Rhine in the Palatinate, up to around 5,000. So it's all the time, it was just a normal village. We have waste pits with just typical settlement waste, which is not very different from what we see in other villages. And if you look at the plant, you will look for any post holes. You will never find them. We haven't had any of them. And we got no house plants. So from the point of view of settlement archaeology, it's just a disappointment, this site. You know, we have much better these preserved villages everywhere, but this double ditch just changes the situation very much. And most of the things I'm talking about, we just concentrated on the excavation technique, which was a very different one from the old excavation in this area here in the 1990s. And we got, my colleagues who worked in the 1990s, I was not even working at Speyer at that time. I started there working in 2001, and then got this project with the research excavation and the following scientific research. We got some settlement burials, which, as I said before, are not unusual in LBK villages. The number is just 12 of them. 5 are in the settlement area in typical burial pits, and the other 7 are found in the ditches, in the inner or outer ditch. This is a not very typical situation. Whether we can recount it under the normal burials is still in question, but at least these are whole skeletons, which I really have to stress this point, because whole skeletons are totally unusual in Herxheim. These are unusual finds, but we got used to them because that was our everyday work. Lots of human skeleton parts, so fragmented bones, skull caps, lots of really smashed small fragments of long bones in huge concentrations. You see a part of one of these concentrations from the old excavation here. We got some torsi as well, where obviously the actors of these strange actions started processing them and cutting them into pieces, but then they stopped at a certain point, and we come back to these 3 torsi again. These are the only ones we have. We also got whole skeletons. We don't know because an anthropologist has been working for the last 3 years on the whole skeletons and on these concentrations where we have lots of not smashed bones. This is a whole skeleton as well. There's just one femur missing. So we have dislocated whole skeletons as well, but the usual thing is what you see here. In the only big concentration which we could excavate in a negative way, our French colleagues who were in my research team at the time, Bruno Bolestin and Christian Jeunesse with some students, excavated this. They are very good in excavating negatively, which is a technique which is not so often used in German archaeology, actually. But it was only possible for this one example to really show what is lying, you know, in one layer, sort of. Although we had layers above it where there was also some pottery and some sherds and some broken bones. Normally, we have about 80 centimeters of fines concentration mixed with lots of earth, so it's not possible to really excavate them negatively. You just have to make it after artificial layers, and then everything was measured 3D. So we have these pictures of concentrations after you just condense it into one layer, and then you see these typical fines concentration, very dense ones. There's not so much material in these ones. Most of it, all what is yellow, are human bones. So that is a real mass of these fragmented human individuals we have here. So in these fines concentrations, how we call them after lots of other names, and this is the most neutral one, so we choose to stick with fine concentrations. They're not only composed of bones and skull caps or smashed jaws, so there's lots of pottery in them. We come to that later on. We have stone tools like and silex implements, quite a number of grinding stones which never look like this one. It's also from Herxheim, but I think it's from a pit of the older settlement. We have got animal bones and a number of animal bone tools like these little borers, and a number of jewelry stuff made from teeth, made from shells, made from limestone, little pearls made of limestone. These animal bone tools and the jewelry are not destroyed. All the other materials had a very similar fate, as we can see. So first we will take a look at the pottery. And this is really was a great puzzle, you know, for my colleague Anthony Denaire, also a French colleague, who is very good in refitting pottery. He has a sort of, I think he must have a sort of photographic memory, because I always imagine him walking along on these long tables full of, you know, thousands of pottery sets, and I already saw this decoration once. Where was it? Where was it? And then he found it, you know. So actually he found lots of refittings from the same concentrations, mainly, but things like these are about 25 meters, and you see all the red ones are decorated pottery sherds with direct refittings, and then we have these undecorated sherds where you also found refittings in not only one concentration, but also neighboring concentration, which means that a huger number of these fine concentrations must have been sort of, the ditch must have been open in these parts, because they were all thrown there at the same time. These pottery sherds have fresh breaks. That means they didn't lie on the ground for a year or two. They were really smashed on site, obviously, and then put into different concentrations. And he found also some very long distance refittings. For example, this is the longest one, this nice pot over here. We have two sherds, one in the outer ditch and in the northwest, and in the southeast here in the inner ditch. That is a difference from a distance of about 240 meters. We get another one like number 10 here. These are three sherds also from the inner to the outer, from the inner ditch. And in this long phase here, we got lots of refitting pottery, which means that actually a number of these things must have happened at more or less the same time, which is rather interesting. Pottery is special in other regards as well. It's a very high quality pottery. We did a workshop in 2004 where two of the colleagues present here, Dan and Václav, were also present and brought some of their pottery, and all the colleagues, 25 or approximately, brought some material from one of these regional styles, which you see here. All this pottery, which you see on the photos here, is from Herxheim, actually. And we wanted to see whether there are differences from the regional pottery which was made in a special regions to the one which we found in Herxheim, which we identified, it must be from the Shaka from Bohemia, or it must be from the Rhine-Main hatching style, so it must come from the Rhine-Main area. And we really saw that the quality of the Herxheim pottery really sticks out from all the other materials we saw, and it was just a number of sherds we could look at there. So it's really finely polished. We have all the surfaces, most of them still intact, which really means this pottery probably wasn't used very long and landed in these fine concentrations soon after some sort of being used in special circumstances, perhaps. Eva Häusler, colleague of mine, with whom I have a small project, or it's a huge project, but it's small in numbers. We're just two persons working in a project which is financed by the German Research Foundations, in German DFG. And she is really working on these different styles, regional styles. In later band ceramic, we can really recognize in regions different styles which we can compare with each other, and they are always a bit different. We got sherds of probably more than 35,000 vessels, but it's a huge number. And Eva Häusler, she made this very nice map where you see where the styles, the regional decoration styles in Herxheim originally stem from, the styles, so to say. I wouldn't say that the pottery which we have in Herxheim actually comes from the Bük area here in northwestern Hungary, for example. We didn't know that 2 years ago that we had this Bük style. Actually, I think we discussed it first in Heidelberg on the conference there, but we are sure now that we have a number of these pots decorated in this style. So we have just one from the Bliquis area in the Paris Basin and one from Bavaria, but from all the other style region, northern Hesse and Alstersaale here in the Eastern German region, and here in southern, in the Alsace, for example, southern Alsace, we've just got numbers between 30 or 150, pot shards which are really decorated in these styles. So naturally, it was very interesting for us to answer the questions: did people come to Herxheim carrying the pottery from Bohemia, from the Alstersaale region, so hundreds of kilometers away, or were these pots, sort of imitated and produced on site or in the local region of Herxheim? And so already in 2010, in another huge project, which was also financed, thankfully, by the German Research Foundation, otherwise I couldn't have done all this research. Well, I didn't do it, but I just presented here with all my colleagues. So Oliver Mecking from the Thuringian Department of Monumental Heritage, she's doing chemical analysis of the raw clay from the material from which these pots were made, and he just looked at different chemical elements which are found in the clays. And for example, he has two elements. I'm not going into detail here, but you see the blue dots are the Palatinate, the Palatinate style of decoration, and the red ones are the Rhine-Main hatching style. And you see there's sort of, one thinks they're sort of separated, but if you look at that directly, you see there's also an area where there's rather mixed. Nevertheless, Oliver was rather sure and said, according to chemical analysis, vessels with some external style in their decoration probably also stem from different regions and are not produced at Herxheim with the local clay material we have here. But we were not really sure, and another colleague from France, Benjamin Gérès, addressed me some time ago. He's a specialist, he's a geoarchaeologist specialist in doing thin slices of pottery and then deciding what kind of minerals are in there, and you can distinguish the different mountainous areas where these minerals came from. That's also perhaps even better way to decide whether material was done on site or the clay came from somewhere else. And we have just some examples of a thin section that is still work in progress. He's not yet really finished with all his analysis, but he already defined some sort of, he calls it clay recipes. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we have some smaller subdivisions in some of these clay recipes. And he got Sherds from us naturally to do thin slices and analyze them. And as you can see, there's a huge mixture of different clay recipes in all of our styles. Okay, the Shaka style that's just seems to be made from two components or from two different clay recipes, but we have, for example, the Neckar area. We have lots of different things, and he is really not so sure at the moment. He hasn't yet finished with all his definitions of the different minerals or so, but he says the thin section analysis shows a huge heterogeneity in the composition of these clays. They are very fine corned, and he hasn't seen some like that in the material of one LBK site, and he has done lots of them in his 30 years of profession as a geoarchaeologist. So he's not really sure what to do of this, but he says probably doesn't come from the same site. But it's not at all clear that everything with something like a Neckar style material really comes from this area as well, because it's so heterogeneous, the material. So we still have a big question mark here, and we're still working on it. I already mentioned this workshop, and all of you will recognize the colleague here. With Dan together, he was on this workshop. We had all this pottery on huge tables and discussed for some days whether this material could come from the regions where the colleagues brought their pottery, which definitely was made in the regions where it was excavated. We couldn't really solve the questions. Also, I can only recommend doing workshops with original material. It was really so many insights for all of us, this 2-day workshop, and I'd really like to do something like that again. But we found some interesting details. There were all these specialists, you know, for the different styles. And I just give you the example of the Erster Saale styles. Eva Häusler, my colleague who's working on the styles, it's found many more examples where you can study the same things. But I'm just showing you this one. So this is the so-called Erster Saale style, typically small, very fine bands in waves around the body of the pot, and then we have incisions on the rim, and we have always incisions on the ends of these 5 or 6 lines or 4 lines of bands going around, lines going around the body. And I beg you to pay attention to these rim decoration and also the small incisions on the ends of these lines, because if you look at the original Erster Saale style, you never have double or even triple lines of small incisions, and there is always, and that's what the specialist Ralf Einecke really stressed, it's always just one incision on the end of, properly on the end of one of the small lines which go around it. And so it seems like in Herxheim somebody was told, well, we want a pot with the decoration, you know, we want these wavy lines around our pot, and then we need incisions on the end of it, and we have incision lines around the rim. So we thought, has never seen something like that. We thought, oh, we'll make 2 lines of incisions on the rim because it looks nice. And okay, they wanted incisions on the end of these lines, so we make some lines of incisions. That's the idea or the impression you get when you look at the pottery here. So it's not yet solved, the questions, where was it done, but I think we tend, Eva and I, and also I think Benjamin comes to the same results. We more tend to say, no, the people didn't take their pottery from farther away regions on their back to Herxheim. It's probably produced here, but perhaps inspired by people who knew how to make the decorations of these different areas. So we are rather sure that many people from different regions came together at Herxheim for special activities. So we just in short look at the other materials which we find in these fines concentrations. There are the stone tools, adzes, and these huge grinding stones. They are also destroyed. An accident like this, destroying the whole body, doesn't happen when you fell a tree, you know. And these were laid into the fire. My colleague Dirk Schimmelpfennig, a specialist on stone implements, he just found out that most of the grinding stones, and we get lots and lots of fragments of them, were put into open fires to just make them more apt to destroy them, because that's what fire does on the stone. And then we have high quality blades made of really good raw materials, and these are just reduced to so-called splintered pieces, which can't be used for anything anymore. And it's only the very good varieties of raw material which are really where the blades are destroyed. So everything which is really precious is rendered into an unusable state. Just come back to the grinding stones. These are some of the whole ones which were probably used in one of the earlier phases, and that's what it's just a small extract of what poor Dirk had to work on, because we have all these smashed and really thick grinding stones here. Then we got these animal bones. We got normal butchery waste, as you find in every settlement in the waste pits, in the settlement pits. But we also have very special things like these bucrania. As you can see here, these two parts fit together in the middle. So it's a special way of preparing the skull of a cattle, that both horn cores still adhere to the same piece of skull. That's called bucrania in classical archaeology, at least. And these are always, they are known, well known in prehistoric societies, and normally they just combine to something, or they just have to do with something symbolical, ritual, something that where we get quite a number of these in the concentrations. We also got agicrania. That's the same thing as a bucranium, made from a goat's head. These are still more seldom than bucrania in general, actually. And then we got a huge number of bones from dogs. Actually, the number of bones, as Rosemarie Arbogast, the archaeologist who worked on them, told me, we got more bones, nearly 300 bones of dogs. That's more than in all settlements where we found bones from dogs altogether. They belong to at least 13 individuals. That's what she found out with Luke Janssens, a specialist for dogs in prehistory. So we got at least 13 dogs here, which were also treated in a very special way. And then we have all these smashed human skeletons, which are naturally the most interesting and intriguing group. Just wanted to tell you something very important. This is one of our hugest concentrations. When you count them, these are 13 skull caps. That means we have at least remains of 13 individuals, but we have more than 13 because we got these parts, these fragments from the parietale, the frontale, that it's the head, the crown of the head. That means these parts can't belong to one of the 13 calottes because those are whole, yeah? The whole calotte is present, and these parts are somewhere here or here. So that means we still have more than just these 13 individuals in this one concentrations. But all you can see is these are all the bones which stem from the postcranial skeleton in these concentrations. I think we have 20 vertebrae, and every human has at least 24 free vertebrae, so we don't have enough for even one person. There's not enough material for all these long bones. That means we never have whole skeletons smashed into pieces and then the whole body in pieces thrown into one concentration. No, they are already, I imagine, you know, huge hills of human bones and other material, and then just a part of it is thrown in here and the other one is deposited somewhere else. That's why we don't have any of these whole skeletons anymore. And I think it was an intention to, you know, to destroy sort of the integrity of the human body, that everything was made unrecognizable and then put into different concentrations. So we know we can't reconstruct any whole bodies. So just some astonishing facts that you get the amount of material we are working with at Herxheim. We got up to 4,000 bone fragments in one concentration. It is one of these examples of that. And all in all, we just weighted some of them. We didn't count 80,000 bones, but we must have something like around 80,000 bone fragments, including skulls and skull caps. The minimum number must be around 600 human individuals, which we excavated. Because we got around 500 skull caps, that makes 500 individuals. And what I showed you here, we got quite a number and never counted them, but at least from more than, or from around 100 more persons, we got small pieces of the crown of the head, which means there are still more than these 500, which we count with the skull caps. For the whole enclosure, this means much more, because 1/3 of the 2 ditches and the settlement area has not yet been excavated. It's preserved in the earth. It's under preservation, so you can't build on it. It's sort of an archive we have in the ground. It's sort of, you know, museum which nobody can see. And I think during my lifetime it won't be excavated, because what we would get, I'm very sure of it, would be more bones, more broken pottery, more destroyed grinding stones. And I don't need more material. I got so much more material. I need new methods and further methods to answer my question. So we better leave this in the ground as a very good archive, and I think that could stay there for quite a while. The pottery, where the relative chronology is very good in LBK, it's one of the best studied cultures of prehistory in Europe, actually. And so we know the chronology is like that. We have only just a span of around 50 years at the end of the band ceramic for this youngest phase of the decoration. That's what we have in our concentrations in Herxheim. So we have no more than 50 years for the killing of around or the death of around 1,000 people, and doing these kind of strange activities there. So naturally, if you have so many people, you also want to know what's the cause of death. Did they have an epidemic here, or what happened? And we find some of the skull caps we have with traumata, which are rather typical. We have them in band ceramic cemeteries as well. This is probably from one of these typical band ceramic stone edges and other traumata here and here, but these are all healed. If you just take a look at them, you know, there's nice growing of bone again, so that these are no causes of death. And actually we have no idea how these people came to their death, because we have all these broken bones and broken ribs, and can never say whether it came from, you know, a killing blow or just the smashing of all these bones. So we are still worrying about the cause of death. It's one of the many question marks I still have concerning Herxheim. What Bruno Balestin, the anthropologist, the French anthropologist who worked on the bones of the research excavations, he just looked at the age at death in the material he was working on, and we have the normal death distribution in cemeteries in the pre-industrial era. Even some LBK cemeteries are somewhere in this gray area here. That's the typical distribution age at death, which you find in cemeteries, where people are supposed to have died some sort of normal death. Normal would be an illness as well as old age, or being a very young child or so. And the red line, this is Herxheim, so it's all totally different here, it seems, because we got quite a number of these younger generations from grown-ups, older children, which are typically the ones we don't find very often on cemeteries, because if you have lived then more, let's say, if you have lived longer than the age of 5 or 6 or so, you're prone to be, you really grow up. It's the best age where you are most healthy, are the, you know, later youth and young adult time. And so they are not supposed to be in the cemeteries. And as you see from the lines here, they are not present. But in Herxheim, we got lots of them in our so-called death community. So it's not a normal distribution of age at death in what we have. So it can't be very well compared to what we find in the graveyard. So we assume that these people were intentionally killed as a sort of human sacrifice or whatever. That's our interpretation at the moment, which I always have to stress can change in some months or years. But at the moment, we are on the idea that these peoples are sort of human sacrifices, which were then, after having been killed in a very rapid sequence, dismembered, defleshed, and then cut into small pieces, the remaining bones, without any soft tissue anymore. So we have traces of this dismemberment on the shoulder blades, on the bones where the tendons and muscles are adhering. You have to cut them through, for example, on the jaws or whatever, and you see these traces from the very sharp silex tools that they use for that. Or, for example, the so-called lifting of the spine. That is, if you want to break open the rump, then you just cut off the connection between the ribs and the vertebrae. and in doing so, you can open the rump much better. And we have an example of this here. This was really still together in the anatomical position. So they started, you know, opening the rump here with destroying the ends of the ribs and also the ends of the vertebra here. But they stopped it because on this side they are all there. The one who is missing here, which is missing here, it's just an accident during excavation. It's really a fresh break. So actually on this side they were all still there. We don't know why they stopped with the process here, but we got these lots of vertebrae where always the outer ends, the processes, the typical lateral ones are missing, which means they are really cut off during this process of dismembering the people, or just cutting them into parts. And we got all these marks and muscle and tendon attachments, as I mentioned before, especially on the jaws. You can see it very well. If you want to cut it off from the upper head, you have this strong muscle here, the chewing muscle, and if you cut it off, you really cut into the bone very often accidentally. And then we have scrape marks on many bones, telling us they really scraped off the last soft tissue to get clean bones, which is very important. If you really want to cut them into small pieces, you have to take off all soft tissue. Otherwise, they don't really break into small pieces. It's just sort of mesh situation then. Well, the last step was then the smashing of the bones and cutting up of the jaws and all this. And this special treatment, which I already mentioned, of the skulls, which were normally, you find some cut marks on it, which adhere to taking off the skin probably, or scalping them or skinning them, whatever. And afterwards on this sort of head line where you put on a head, and on the lower line of the head, that's where they sort of cut with some variations, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. They cut off the facial skeleton and the base, and what remains are these sort of bow-like, I would say, artifacts, the skullcaps. So, but we concentrated very much on the ditches, because with the majority of our finds stem from these two ditches, especially the inner one is filled with these concentrations. I'm talking of more than 100 of these finds concentrations in the ditches. But we got a small number of settlement pits, for example, this one over here, where we also had this typical mixture of skullcaps, as you can see here, sherds of pottery. This is, for example, our only vessel from Bavaria, with a decoration of the Bavarian style from, for example, from Stephan's Posching and surroundings, as Joachim Pechtel told me. And we also have a small whole skeleton here of a newborn baby. You see here, you can even just think about the flexed position of the legs. It's not at all processed, so no manipulation traces. That was just put there as a sort of burial, I don't know. But otherwise, we have some of these pits with concentration material in them as well, which is really astonishing. So to sum these observations up, we got these totally fragmented skeletons, skullcaps. So the human skeleton is totally sort of destroyed. The pottery is broken in smaller or larger pieces intentionally, all of this, and the stone implements, as I showed you, are also systematically destroyed. And we have these special, symbolically charged animal remains like Bucrania and Aegicrania. And what we see here are highly standardized, normed, even repetitive practices, because this didn't happen in one moment. Probably we have different sequences when these actions took place, although I can't say how large the number is because we can't really date them. We got, as we assume at the moment, human sacrifices. So people are killed with a special idea behind this, probably a religious one. We have this special fabrication of the calottes. The artifacts, which are really of high quality or very important ones, are always destroyed, and then everything is deposited in ditches or sometimes in pits in these mixed finds concentrations. So everything which is very standardized, normed, and always practiced in a repetitive pattern is something which is normally defined as a ritual. So we are thinking about special rituals which took place in Herxheim. So actually, naturally, we wanted to know who are these people. First, we assumed as we only have normal LBK material in our concentrations and in the settlement pits as well, we assumed, well, these must be LBK people. And as we had this pottery from very far away, we thought perhaps we can distinguish the strontium amount in their teeth when they grew up on some other loess area far away from the Herxheim area. So that was the first reason why we did some strontium analysis on around 100 of these people, these smashed people from the ditches, from teeth and from even jaw individuals, because we just have singular isolated jaws, where Ruven Turk, who did all these analyses, took the teeth, the first molar and sometimes the third molar, and we could decide on the bone, on the teeth of cattle and pigs and some wild animals from settlement ditches. We could decide on the strontium ratio from the site of Herxheim and its surroundings. So we know people who were born there and got the strontium into their animal of the teeth in their first years, then they are really originated from Herxheim, and otherwise they're not. What we didn't expect at all, but something like this is not so astonishing. Some people lived on other loess sites, may even be shell lime underground or something like marl or so. These have lower strontium values like that in Herxheim, so they are not from Herxheim and the surroundings. They live in some other lowland areas. But what was really astonishing is the huge number of people who come from mountainous areas. They were born and raised in areas where we have no, especially the higher ones, no LBK population at all. We have no settlements in the upper parts of the Palatinate forest, for example, who would only be responsible for some of the lower ones because it's bunter sandstone and not gneiss and granite, which we need. So that might be the Vogesen or the Taunus, some areas farther away. But unfortunately, strontium just tells us this is a high granite mountain where people grew up and were born, but strontium doesn't tell us, well, this was the Taunus or it was the Erzgebirge or whatever. So, but what is astonishing that we have these high values, people who grew up and were born, and most of them where he took the M3, the third molar, which is developed between 7 and 14, approximately the age of 7 and 14. And they also stayed in the mountains because these teeth also have these high granite values, which we found here. So actually, if you count from 100 to 1,000 with its mathematical statistics, which you might very well do because we chose from any possible place in our region, or in our excavation area, we choose these 100 samples, then you can say 90% of our dead are strangers. They didn't grow up, at least. They didn't grow up, and they were not born at Herxheim or its nearer surroundings, which is very astonishing in itself, but it's more astonishing that these are people from areas where we don't have any idea that there lived people at all around 5,000, because we don't have any mountainous LBK settlements. So, well, Bruno Bolestin said, well, it's totally easy. The solution is they just chased every year 20 for 50 years. That makes 1,000. And they just went into the mountains and chased the latest Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, which were still there. That was his idea. So this, this strict number of 20 each year, and this for 50 years, it didn't appeal to me very much. Nevertheless, we said, okay, we take we took the crowns from teeth for the animal, and so now we took the roots from the same teeth from people who had these high values. We took about 30, 35, 40 samples and gave them to Joachim Burger, or he took the samples, we gave the teeth to him. So we knew we are doing the genetics because he's a paleogenetic, Joachim Burger at Mainz. And we knew these are now the genetic signs of the people who were born and raised in high mountainous areas, says the strontium. What does the genetic sample say? We have here the typical Mesolithic DNA. We know that it's totally different from these in migrated LBK people. That's very nice for us because we can differentiate them rather well. These are modern Europeans, which genetic specialists always use for comparison. I have no idea, I'm not a geneticist. And these are sampled from various LBK sites. There has been done quite some ADNA sampling in the last 10 years around that. And if you look at it in detail, you see these nice green dots here. These are about 30 altogether. They are always sitting one above the other, and they are smack in the middle of this typical LBK haplogroups. That means from genetical point of view, we have normal, typical LBK people. Whereas the strontium says these people grew up in the mountains and they were born there as well. So who are they? LBK communists, typical LBK people living in mountainous areas, but they can't be really, you know, tillers, because they need huge plain areas for cultivating grains and other vegetables and things like that. Or is there existent a group of band ceramic hunter-gatherers, which we don't know because they don't leave many traces in the mountains, they don't build big houses or whatever? We just don't know at the moment. So that is still one of the mysteries of Herxheim. We really don't know who are these dead in our 2 ditches and some pots. And this is one of the very recent preliminary results from a huge group. Ron Pinasi, a paleogeneticist from the University of Vienna, told me it's the biggest sample we've ever done in Neolithic in Europe. We have sampled 560 different petrous bones and teeth roots, and actually 521 of these samples could be processed and gave results. And we already know at the moment we have lots of details which I don't know yet, and I have not yet done anything with this. I just presented to you the results. We got a double number of female individuals from these 520, which is nearly all, really the whole number of people we excavated, I think. And only 177 male, and just a very small number where it is unknown. So it's a very good result as well, but it's astonishing as well. Yeah, we have double as much female than male, and I'm still thinking about how to interpret this. Concerning kinship, because that is one of the main questions, as it looks now, we just have for a very small number of this huge group of individuals from the ditches at Herxheim, we have any kinship relations at all which were detected. That is not yet the final result, but that's just what they did on first view and could tell me or gave me in a database. So this means that we wouldn't think of whole villages, you know, taken as prisoners and then killed at Herxheim, because you would expect in a village that people who are also related to each other, or at least some groups of them, would exist in these villages. But we don't really know at all what this should mean. So what I tried to do in a year ago or so, to look at the whole bodies and these torsi, because we had never taken any or the other anthropologists had never really looked at them. They were only interested in all these smashed people, you know, they're much more interesting than typical burials or these torsi or so. But Antje Lange, a young anthropologist who's been working for 3 years now on these skeletons and on the torsi, it's finding out really interesting things. For example, these two had their legs cut off at the knee, or here the epiphysis is cut in two, and these are cut above the knee. So we have two very similar torsi with part of the spinal column. And this is very interesting as well, because it's really an anatomical connection. That means there was still some flesh on the spinal column when it was put there together with the head, which is still sitting in the right position on it. But they started making a calotte of it, because the whole facial part of the skull is missing already, and then they stopped it all, and we still have what we don't see in this drawing. There's one femur here as well. So these are sort of similarly treated torsi, but I can't tell you at all why they stopped, you know, processing them further, like all the other individuals that were cut into small pieces. These are all actually men around 30 years of age. The sexual decision of which sex they were. It was done by Antje Lange using the pelvis, which is very good for deciding this. And it was actually strengthened by the genetic, no, they couldn't do genetics on these, sorry, they did it only with heads. I'm not saying that. So this is just an anthropological gender, but I think it's rather good. And they have nearly the same age, around 30, and they all come from one of these fines concentrations and are sort of similarly treated, but I have no idea why. Very, very interesting for me are these three individuals, because all we have seen until now are sort of the victims, you know, the people were killed by somebody and processed and whatever. But we have no idea who is the group of the actors. I mean, probably not only people from Herxheim, because it was a small village and that is a lot of work to process all these humans and the material as well. And among our burials, typical flex birds, we have three which are very, very interesting. They are extremely flexed, as you can see here, so they must have been put into bandages or something else. Otherwise, you can't keep your knees in this height in death, or people can't do it like that. And all of them are, although the photos don't show it, these were made on site. The excavators, my colleagues in the 1990s, just cleared out all the material to have a nice picture of the skeleton. But if you see the documentation, and Fabian Haag, who worked on the research excavation and on all the ditches in his PhD thesis, he just made drawings of all the material with the skeletons, and you see all three of them lie in the middle of huge fines concentrations in sort of the upper layer, but they were not put on top of them. We have quite a number of skullcaps lying around these persons and sherds, which are on the same height as these people. And that means they were really put into one of these concentrations, and they are local. Yeah, from their petrous bones, we could definitely say, no, from their strontium, we could definitely say they are local, and the genetic sex were the same as the anthropological sex. They are males between 30 and 40, extremely flexed in concentrations. Two are definitely local, and this one comes from lower sandstone. So that might be 5 or 6 kilometers west of Herxheim. That's where the beginning of the Palatinate forest is. So he might have grown up there and then moved to Herxheim, whatever. And look at him at local as well. So it seems we got three of these actors of the things which happened here, and having them, you know, very nicely put in a flex position and then smack in the middle of one of these concentrations seems for me to show that this is not ritual waste, which is thrown away, you know, after having, you know, played with it and then we throw it away. It seems to be it's something important, and it's perhaps even for people of high status, it's a very good thing to be buried in the middle of these ritual remains. That's sort of a message which I at the moment seem to get from these three burials, which are really very interesting. So I have to be quicker now. So I just give you an idea of the different, of the most important interpretative approaches to Herxheim, because the interpretation never finished and we can't say exactly what it is, but we got two main streams. One of them is cannibalism and one is no cannibalism. We are sure that we don't have any, you know, sort of mass burials here. I showed you the 12 burials we have. The other things are not really burials. These are the remains of special ritual activities where the human remains are sort of treated like precious objects, which are smashed into pieces as well. So Bruno Bolestin, the anthropologist who worked on the research excavation, is totally sure that we have a sort of site of mass cannibalism here, that all these people were eaten, and for him the best proof of this cannibalism are the finger bones, because the ends of them are from the bigger ones on are always sort of destroyed. And he said, well, it's a total proof of cannibalism because they do mâchement in French. That means they just gnaw on the bones to extract this small amount of marrow which is in a finger bone. Actually, it doesn't work, but I didn't know that at the time when he even published it like that. Yeah, cannibalism is proven by these small finger bones. You can read it in his publication together with Anne-Sophie Coupé, because unfortunately they didn't publish in our big Herxheim publication. They did it separately, but it doesn't really matter. Most important is that you can read it somewhere. If you look precisely at these bones, then you have a huge amount of each finger bone, which is just not a sort of very weak bone. And the marrow is just in a small part in the middle where there is really a harder bone. There's a small part just in the middle. So it starts, oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Go on, sorry. So the marrow is just in the middle part here, and the gnawing didn't help because I never reached the marrow. And I asked myself, if you have, you know, a huge number of people which you have eaten before, why do you just gnaw at the finger bones as a dessert or something like that? It's sort of ridiculous. Although, admittedly, there are a number of traces on the bones which you naturally could combine with cannibalism as well, but there is no factual proof that we have cannibalism here, and there are a number of arguments against cannibalism as well. I'm always collecting new because I'm not really persuaded of this cannibalism theory. Bruno says, well, he got some jaws where only the front bones were burnt, and he says that is typical for, they must have roasted these heads on the spit, because we see it in animals, the lips are rolled up from the heat, and here you still have flesh, so only the front bones are burnt. The anthropologist Silja Bauer, who worked on a part of the old excavation that is also published in the second of our Herxheim volumes, she had a number of jaws, not one of them with only front teeth totally burnt, but the whole jaw, all the teeth, also the molars were burnt. So you wouldn't do that by, you know, roasting something on a spit, because then everything must have burned, all the flesh you had. So it's no use trying to eat it afterwards, because there would not be left anything. And we got all these, quite a number of calottes, not all these, but I think 5 or 6 of calottes, where you have on the breaks and on the inside of the calottes, you have these traces of burning. So they were all the calottes when they came into a fire. So these fire arguments for roasting people on the spit just don't work at all in my eyes. And also the production, the repeated production of calottes can't be really very well combined with cannibalism. These were not put into fires and heated with the brain still in it, so there are no traces of fire on these. So I think that doesn't work very well. What might work better is something like the idea of extreme processing as part of special rituals. These expression extreme processing was developed in southwestern USA, in parts where the Anasazi, the predecessors of the nowadays Pueblo Indians, lived, and you find huge accumulations of bones, even smashed bones, although not so strongly smashed as in Herxheim. And colleagues in America who work on these have brought up this discussion point of extreme processing as part of integration feasts, of identifying oneself with the community, so everybody does it together, and it's a very important part of special feasts which were done there. So this might have been the case in Herxheim as well. And I always wondered, why did they, you know, destroy all these artifacts? But if you look at these things, these might be objects which were used in feasting, because every ritual goes together with eating and drinking. Name me some feast which doesn't work with, or ritual, even in Christian Abendmahl, you know, you sort of symbolically eat the body of Christ and you drink his blood. So it's a sort of symbolic feasting, if you want to say it like. And all these things might have been used in a big feast where they ate, you know, on a spit, but pigs and whatever, not the humans. And after having been sort of symbolically charged, you know, ritually charged in using them in a ritual meal, they can't be used in the normal nowadays meals anymore, or for working on woods also, because they are symbolically charged, ritually charged now. And we know it from quite a number of prehistoric cultures that then these ritually charged objects have to be destroyed for human use. For the gods, it's not important whether you have your sword, you know, just put into or just broken or so. It's just the giving of the sword which is important. And it might be something like we have to destroy this material, that it can't be used anymore because it's ritually charged. And so the highlight of the ritual might be the sacrificing of these strangers and processing their bodies, and then the destructions of all these ritually charged objects from the feasting followed. And afterwards it was all, as we did for a film of National Geographic TV, it was all put into these huge concentrations in the ditches, probably in the night or so. And that is a nice picture. I really like it, from a Danish history journal who wanted to write something about Herxheim, and I had long telephones with the journalist and described what we found there and so. And then he had one of his painters just do a graphic installation of what happened. And naturally you have to have moonlight and people dancing half naked around the fires, and people were processing the things here with lots of blood, and you see all the bones. And I really enjoy this picture just for showing it at the end of my lecture. So we have all these questions. We don't have a good analogy up till now for this huge activities which we have in Herxheim. Why it was done at Herxheim, we don't know. Topographically, it's not at all a very special site. And what is the purpose and the function of these rituals at the end of the LBK, which is an important point because things change. And in the West, they seem to, in the Western distribution area of the LBK, they seem to change rather quickly, and something might be not working anymore in their worldview, in their cosmology, and perhaps they have to do drastical things to change the views of the gods. We really don't know. Very important for us, and I hope that's at least one question we perhaps will still get better at. Who are the dead in our ditches at Herxheim? I really don't know. But work never ends in Herxheim. Despite all these question marks, we go on, and you see I just have quite a number of things going on. That is the pottery DFG funded research project with Eva Häusler, which is still going on. I just could lengthen it for a year, fortunately, so we will be working on until end of June 2027, and we hope to have the publication finished at that time as well. And since 2004, Benjamin Gerès, as I already showed you before, is doing this petrographic analysis. I'm hoping for results in the summer. Antje Langer is just writing her MA thesis about what she found out about the whole skeletons and the torsi, which are, although it's just 0.6% of our 600 individuals, these few individuals are very interesting as well. And we do this huge comprehensive ADNA analysis with Ron Pinasi and David Reich from the University of Harvard, where I already showed you some preliminary results. I have no idea what to do make of them, but we are still waiting for their precise analysis of this. And C&N isotope analysis for diet and nutrition are already done by Berta Morell from the Spanish Research Council in Barcelona, and she just looked at these people from the upper regions of low-range mountains, because she took samples from the jaws where the teeth were used for strontium analysis, and so we know which jaws are the ones where the people came from the higher mountains. And I'm very interested, did these people who grew up in mountainous areas, did they have another nutrition, another diet than the people in the lower areas? You would think so, because probably they don't have so many grains in the higher mountains. But as Berta just told me some days ago, it doesn't really look like that. So I can't say more because that's just what he told me, but it's also not so easy to grasp these people from the higher mountains. And yeah, we're going on with our work and coming back in some years with totally different results, perhaps. We'll see. Thank you very much for your attention.